great to be back, and we're here with Shirley Bloomfield at the Fiber Connect 2021. Shirley, you were just on a panel talking about infrastructure and investment, and it all leads back to what happened in the last 18 months and how your members did some amazing things. And you just had some great statistics. Why don't we talk about some of those? Maybe North Dakota, start there.
Absolutely. Talk about a lesson learned, right? And if we've learned a lesson about what networks need to do and how they need to be scalable, I think we learned that during the last 18 months. So one of the things I was sharing with folks was the fact that, how community-based providers actually rose to the need that they saw in their own communities. And an example is in the great state of North Dakota, which already has a very robust fiber infrastructure. But what happened is as soon as the pandemic hit, schools shut down, the State Department of Education worked immediately with all of the community-based providers in the state. And what they did is they worked together to identify those school children that did not have broadband connectivity at home. And within 3 weeks, 99.8% of all school children in the state of North Dakota were connected. So they were able to stay online. They were able to continue to take the remote learning and their courses and didn't miss a beat. And that is the power, I think, of community-based providers really focused on, how do I serve my community? We're now in an emergency situation. What do I do? How do I pivot? And I love everything about, what these carriers are providing.
Yeah, and I think that is a key thing. I think you mentioned in the infrastructure discussions that there is more talk about community-based providers, whatever their corporate structure.
Yeah, so that is actually a first because I think policymakers tend to default to what they know, and what they know are large national carriers, right? Because they have big advertising budgets and they're kind of the incumbent carrier in a lot of these metropolitan areas. So what was so gratifying to me was as soon as the White House started putting out some of their infrastructure thoughts, one of the things they did is they started talking about community-based providers. They started talking about cooperatives. They started talking about, local entities. Now, the one challenge I will say is getting them to truly understand that regardless of your corporate structure, whether you're a cooperative, you're a family held, you're a locally held, the fact that you are local is really what makes the difference. And so that is why we've been really working with both Congress and the White House to really emphasize that funding that comes down from infrastructure to prioritize community-based providers because, trust me, they are the ones who are living in that community, serving their neighbors, their kids are going to school there. They have every vested interest to use that money to make a difference.
Yeah, and you've lived this, but you're not 5 states away making that decision, right?
Absolutely. I've worked for large carriers, so I know how some of those financial decisions can get made, and they are made on the market where you're going to get the highest ROI. Well, the difference truly is, I will never forget a story that came to me on why a company started doing some telemedicine with their local healthcare clinic, and that was because the general manager of the telephone company every day was taking his mother to get her heart monitored to the doctor's office, and finally he had one of those, I could have had a V8 moment where he was like, you know what, I can connect the clinic with broadband, from the home and work on getting some of these appropriate devices. And therein, rose, it's kind of like, what is your need and how do we solve the problem that needs to be solved? And that is part of what I think, again, small companies, innovators can really do very quickly.
Well, and that kind of leads to the whole idea of the smart rural communities, which NTCA has been championing for a while.
I love the idea of smart rural communities. And when we talk about how entities and community-based providers need to tell their story, there's nothing that tells the story quite like being a smart rural community. And it's recognizing that the fiber and the infrastructure is kind of the brains behind what you're doing, but it's the applications that make a community smart. It's how are you using it for public health? How are you using it for public safety? What are you doing for education? What are you doing on healthcare or precision ag? There's so many of these applications, and getting the community around and excited about the fact that, for example, you may have a very robust fiber infrastructure. Now, what do we do with it? And there's a small part of me that still has a sliver of hope that as we've gone through this pandemic, that people will say, you know what, I don't necessarily want to live in New York City, or I don't need to live in San Francisco. Can I live in a community where I might like the quality of life better, but still have access to all the things that will make a community smart?
And one of the things, as the infrastructure is discussed, there was access challenges, but affordability and adoption challenges. And how's that being addressed in your view?
So Congress is very, very focused on the fact, and I think it came to being, a little bit during the pandemic when so many people who needed connectivity simply couldn't afford connectivity. They may have lost their job, may have been furloughed. So the idea behind, well, how do you make sure that people stay connected? Because frankly, if you've lost your job, you actually probably need connectivity to find your next job or to apply for benefits or whatever all of those things might be. So Congress is very focused right now on what would be an affordable kind of provision as we look at infrastructure. In the short run, they've created an emergency broadband program that does allow for some additional supplemental help, access to one-time purchase of some equipment, which is a big step forward. The question is, how do we go forward from here? And as they're looking at infrastructure initiatives, my guess will be that you will see a portion of the $65 billion carved out that will be used to address affordability. I think you'll see a portion that will be looked to be carved out to address digital inclusion. How do we make sure that we have the full universe of people who could and should participate? And then you've got access to equipment. And I'm always amazed at how that piece gets left off the table a little bit because people assume that somebody was able to buy a $600 smartphone or they have a laptop or they have an iPad. And that is not the case in millions of Americans' reality. So I think we've got to also be thinking if we're really going to look for universal broadband coverage, we've got to make sure that those other pieces also come into play.
Well, and you also alluded to the idea is how it is allocated, it has to be careful too, because it could be rate regulation if not done right.
You've got to be very careful here because I think once you start talking about these types of issues, it opens the door for policymakers in particular to kind of have their dream list. And sometimes the dream list doesn't always mesh well with a carrier's reality, for example. So one of the things that had been on the table is how do you offer a low-cost option for a plan so that you can get people online? That is a great way to do it. Let the carriers figure out what that low-cost option is and then make sure that if you're getting federal support, that you have one. Once you start saying every plan you offer, every bucket, every tier of service, or we would like to set your rates, like the attempt was made in the state of New York, simply is a massive disinvestment incentive for investment, for innovation. You're going to find that carriers, frankly, can't afford to provide some of those services. And so instead of actually getting more folks online, I think you've got a real opportunity, if you get too aggressive on rate setting, to disincentivize providers to actually go into some of these high-cost markets. So very, very cautious about watching what policymakers are doing on this front.
I guess the other challenge, too, is making sure that people know that the opportunity is out there as well.
And that is really hard. So let's say you've got folks who English is not a first language, or, honestly, a lot of the ways we find information is we go online. Well, if you're not already online, how are you able to find that information? It's those pieces that are disconnects. The thing about the current EBB program that I struggle a little bit with, and I'm so delighted that hundreds of our NTCA members are participating, is the fact that the onus is on the customer. So it is very limited in terms of what the carriers can do to help get these people signed up. So again, you may be talking about different barriers, and if we're really going to make that a ubiquitous program, we've got to make it easier for consumers to participate.
Well, Shirley, it's great catching up with you in person, and
it's so nice to see you. I'm so used to a little screen, but it's nice to see all of you, Ken. So again, thanks for all you do.
Thanks. Take care.
You too.